Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 20th edition of the RCI Pod. In this edition dedicated to the presentation of ADB's International Investment Agreement Toolkit. I'm very pleased to welcome a very insightful and interesting group of panelists, and we will have also the presentation by the main author of this interesting report. I would like to give the floor first for opening remarks to our Chief Economist and Director General of the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department, Yasuyuki Sawada. Over to you, Yasuki.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rolando. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this RCI POD webinar for the presentation of the ADB International Investment Agreement Toolkit. This new database and toolkit will be a valuable contribution for experts and policymakers working to improve investment policy in the region. I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists for joining us here today in order to discuss just how the toolkit and related work can be used. I would also like to express my gratitude to the authors and the different ADB departments, in particular the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, and Office of the General Counsel for their contribution and continuous support to this project. FDI remains an important source of external financing for developing Asia, with FDI inflows representing on average 4.9% of regional GDP since year 2001. International Investment Agreement, in short IIAs, have been instrumental in this expansion, as they safeguard the economic interests of investors and host economies and shape foreign investment policy. As of year 2020, Asia had more than 1,000 investment agreements in force, combined with nearly 80 trade agreements containing investment chapters or provisions. In recent years, however, the number of investor-state disputes has increased, with some arguing investment agreements may impose costs on states and not always deliver on their objectives. Investment treaties have also been under scrutiny during COVID-19. The pandemic has forced governments to consider extraordinary measures on foreign investment, such as stronger FDI screening regimes to prevent hostile foreign takeovers, to balance public interest and economic objectives, potentially creating tensions and interruptions in global businesses. This report provides a new framework for assessing the network of international investment regimes in Asia and the Pacific. A comprehensive database for the region, including bilateral investment treaties and investment chapters in free trade agreements, was assembled in order to provide granular information on 15 investment provisions. The toolkit presents a novel approach to compare the structure of agreements and assess their roles and possible implications on foreign investment. It also expands our knowledge of provisions for new generation treaties, such as public interest obligations or non-economic standards. The toolkit is designed for practitioners to develop new metrics in different areas of treaty design, to measure, for example, the degree of control maintained by the state over foreign investment, the level of discrimination between domestic and foreign investors, or the quality of investor-state dispute mechanisms. The ADB toolkit aims to complement ongoing efforts to reform the investment treaty agenda and provides a balanced approach that grants investment protection while supporting the development objectives of host states. Improving the design of provisions and modernizing investment agreement will not only help to prevent investor-state dispute, but also attract more and better quality FDI into the region. ADB will continue to support these efforts to encourage a better investment climate in the region. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Junkyu Lee, Chief Financial Sector at the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of ADB, for the welcome address. And after, I would like to ask Professor Julien JC to give a brief presentation of the report. The presentation will be followed by a panel discussion with our distinguished guests. I very much look forward to the contribution from our speakers and the participants. With that, I'd like to stop my opening remarks. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, over to you, Junkyu.
Thank you, Yasu. Dear distinguished panelists and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and also good morning, good afternoon, good evening to my colleagues and around the world. And let me welcome you and congratulate on this important knowledge work, including today's presentation of the International Investment Agreement Toolkit by ADB. The publication of this report and database is the culmination of several years of collective hard effort for producing a flexible tool that can help researchers, practitioners, and the policymakers in assessing the complex network of investment agreements in the Asia-Pacific region. I want to thank all of the colleagues and who have been involved in the production of this report, and special thanks should go to our ERCD colleagues and also Professor Julian Chase, who have committed to the delivery of the toolkit to date. Thank you so very much. I would also like to provide some context to remind us on how we began this journey. International investment agreements have been key part of Asian economy's FDI policy framework to support economic growth and industrial development. Their impact goes beyond increasing bilateral FDI flows and extend to improving the overall institutional framework and governance for investment. Aside from providing capital to drive industrialization, FDI has been an important seed in the region for productivity, technological transfer, job creation, and skills development. This was stressed in our previous analysis for the 2016 Asian Economic Integration Report. Theme chapter, the report also explored the evolving nature of investment agreements, how their heterogeneity in key provisions has grown over time, and how those specific provisions related to policy trends have become more substantive to investors. Empirical analysis of the cross-sectional and the panel approaches already show that the policy choice of engaging BITs has achieved significant successes in attracting FDI projects. And also the most important provisions from the analysis are ISDM, so-called investor state dispute mechanism in BITs, and also the national treatment and most favored nations in FTAs. Granting foreign investors international arbitration rights and guarantees of non-discrimination are particularly important for attracting FDI projects. But it is notable that BITs and RTIAs vary in their effectiveness in encouraging FDI projects depending on design and negotiation outcomes of their provisions. Overall, the institutional setting remains central to understand and promote FDI. This brief account allows me to connect with our motivation behind this initiative. A first consideration for embarking in this project was that despite the gains from increasing cross-border flows and globalization, the cost for governments, particularly our developing member countries, for engaging, concluding, and implementing investment agreements is high. Negotiation and enforcement can be complex, and supporting this process remains important. Many developing countries still lack capacity to draft and negotiate model treaties and to implement the provisions. So there is a need to provide and to strengthen training and legal services to those countries. A second consideration is that investment agreements, both BITs and investment chapters in FTAs, are often treated as homogeneous entities, even though the included provisions can vary widely across treaties. A tool to make comparable these features while underlining the nuances and specificities of each agreement may contribute to understand their economic implications. Governments can explore the kind of agreements that other countries are engaging and concluding and see their main components, features, and issues. Third, as different templates in investment agreements become more dominant, understanding the differences and coherent elements in all the new generation agreements is increasingly important. Policymakers can receive objective advice on how to better design their agreements in order to foster FDI, but also support other legitimate goals such as job creation or setting investment standards. BI2 reform remains controversial in some developing countries due to the view that international agreements may infringe state rights and sovereignty and interfere with the developing objective. At the same time, there is a growing consensus that improving certain areas of the treaty design, such as strengthening investor-state dispute mechanisms or non-discrimination provisions, can bring benefits for all involved parties. There is a political economy on the design and reform of investment agreements that may not be fully captured in our proposed framework. However, efforts to inform and improve our understanding of these issues can only be beneficial in the long term. Directions should continue to be charted down the road to support our ADB member countries in adapting a regulatory environment that attracts the right FDI, conducive to achieve national development goals and contributing to regional integration. We hope this toolkit will offer an instrument to go in this direction. I look forward to some lively discussions as we move to the presentation and panel discussion. Thank you so very much.
All right, so I think it's my turn now. You should all be able to see the short PowerPoint I'll be using for this presentation. Let me begin by congratulating the ADB, and in particular its Regional Cooperation and Integration Division for, I would say, this very impressive collaborative work. Especially want to thank Chief Economist Sawada for his continuous support, as well as Dr. Jongkyu Lee and Sen-Young Park, who have been there since, I would say, the beginning. And I remember that the beginning was somewhere in 2017 in Hong Kong. So in short, I believe that the ADB IIA toolkit is a very important instrument in a fast evolving area of economic policy. And so I'm delighted to give you an overview of its rationale, design, and possible applications today. I'd like to start with some context to stress the fact that investments and investment policies have gained considerable importance over the past years. As a result, the ADB toolkit, which helps to better understand and shape investment policy, is a new tool that should help policymakers improving the way they approach investment policies and investment treaties in particular. Taking a quick look at the last 3 decades, we observe the global amplification of international financial flows in the form of foreign direct investments, notably. I would say that from a general reluctance to open up too much to FDI, the world and Asia Pacific in particular have now embraced liberation policies. But at the same time, these political choices are increasingly questioned and challenged. These choices are also increasingly under the scrutiny of a global civil society that vary of the human and environmental risks generated by FDI. In any case, new players have emerged with the much greater role also of developing economies and their firms in not only receiving, but also generating FDI. What has driven the rise of investment policies and investment treaties in particular is the notion of protection, how to protect investment. In a sense, investment protection seeks to mitigate the risks involved under FDIs and aims to make sure that investors will be treated fairly when they invest abroad. So the desire to draw foreign investment has led most, if not all, countries to adopt policies that are designed to create a favorable investment climate. Sometimes this is without thinking about longer-term consequences as far as sovereignty and regulatory independence are concerned. So this is a tension. This is this tension that the toolkit helps to better analyze. On the one hand, increasing protection, and on the other hand, a need to have a final assessment of long-term consequences in order to assess and design better investment policies and better investment treaties. This tension I just described is not about to disappear. We don't have the solution. But that's why the ADB toolkit has a role to play. In the era of the post-COVID pandemic, investment promotion and investment are likely to become even more important. As a matter of fact, economies are paying attention to many new growth areas, which may lead to decisions to protect more or protect differently foreign investors. I say new growth areas, and by this I mean digital technology, communication technology, e-commerce, related services, which see the upward trend potential, which is already documented by many recent ADB studies and reports. So FDI policies will remain key for all economies in the year to come. We can now take a closer look at the trends in investment agreements negotiations. You have here a very famous diagram produced by the UNCTAD, and you see the trend for the period 1980 to 2020. This is the latest data published by UNCTAD in July 2020. So this very classic diagram shows that IIAs began to proliferate in the mid-2000s, and the stock of these treaties keep increasing until now. It means that there is a real and strong appetite from governments in using investment agreements to attract FDI. Whether it's good or bad, it's a question we can discuss a little later. But it seems that IIAs generally, for many and for most Asian Pacific countries, constitute one of the most essential instruments to amplify stability and certainty in all the investor-state relations. Now, behind these relatively simple trends, which are always good to remind, there is a number of interesting features that I want to highlight. First, there is a great diversity of investment agreements. The bilateral investment agreements, or the bilateral investment treaties, are the classical facets of the investment regime, while free trade agreements, FTAs, that include sometimes investment chapter, proliferate, in particular in Asia, with, for example, the CPTPP or the RCEP, which are both very important developments in the region. Now, overall, there are currently over than 2,600 investment agreements in force, whether in the form of BITs or FTAs. Let me just say that although there is no standard form for BITs and FTAs in the way they deal with investment, many are broadly a collection of similar protections, which can, however, vary a lot in terms of scope, intensity, and consequences. The second point I want to highlight here is that investment agreements have an official purpose, an official objective. According to states, it's a fact, one of the expected major benefits of investment agreements is the creation of a stable legal framework for investment relations. This stability is intended to stimulate, promote cross-border FDI. So generally, investment treaties are expected to create the legal and institutional conditions for attracting FDI into industries and projects that further host state development, especially in countries where you have weak domestic legal regimes and weak respect of the rule of law. Let me note also that in the event of disputes, BITs and FTAs may provide with an access to investor-state dispute settlement, which in a sense may remove disputes between foreign investors and government agencies from the purview of local courts and tribunals. That's a big issue in which that I think I won't have to discuss much, but that's been also another development, the rise of investment disputes that justified this research. So again, this data that you see here was released in July 2020. In fact, many more IIAs have been concluded since the data was released at that time. There is the RCEP, which I mentioned. There is also the China-EU Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which was concluded in principle in late December, and many other BITs in the region. So clearly the trend towards, the trend in terms of investment treaty rulemaking is upward. There are more and more investment treaties, with perhaps the correlative risk of more disputes in the year to come. Now, looking at this huge number of investment treaties, policymakers, NGOs, all those working on investment policies and investment treaties have difficulties dealing with all these treaties, the latest treaties, and their latest innovations. It's a challenge because no one can be expected to know, study so many different treaties at once. And that's why, it's one of the reasons why we developed this toolkit. So let me briefly outline the methodology used to create the toolkit. In a nutshell, in one sentence, the ADB toolkit creates a granular codification of provisions, of investment treaty provisions, through a detailed textual analysis of a large number of investment agreements currently signed and enforced by at least one ADB countries. Okay, so the scope of the data sets is Asia Pacific, more precisely ADB members, and it's at these treaties that you find coded in the data set. We need to have at least one ADB member party to the treaty. Now, let me unpack this. Let me unpack the methodology. A first point is that the toolkit codifies Asia Pacific IIAs into 15 provisions. There is a binary codification of relevant provisions that we carried out through this detailed textual reading. And the 15 provisions are the ones you see here. So to name them, the definition of investments, the question of the admission of investments into a host economy, the national treatment, the most favored nation treatment, the Equitable treatments, the question of expropriation, the free transfer of investments, the question of non-economic standards that can be covered by investment treaties, dispute resolution, umbrella clauses, the temporal scope of application, the potential performance requirements that may be prohibited by some treaties, the transparency mechanisms, the public interest obligations, and the exceptions when they are available. So it's quite a lot. The basic idea is that these 15 provisions are very important in all these investment treaties. The 15 provisions appear in this order, but this order does not reflect any specific importance. Okay, there is no hierarchy as for whether investment is number 1 and exceptions are number 15. Okay, there is nothing important here. We will see later that all or only part of these provisions can be used in terms of application of the toolkit. So the toolkit had the ambition to be as comprehensive as possible, had the ambition to capture as many details of more than 1,000 investment treaties, but it doesn't mean that the data that you find in the data sets got to be used in one block. It's possible at the time of the applications, the use of the data sets, to focus on one, two, or all of these provisions, and so on. Okay, there is a great flexibility that I will further discuss a little later. So there are 15 provisions which, by definition, are different, and they have a different purpose. However, their common point is that they have a potential impact on an investment decision. They can lead an investor to decide to invest or not, or to only invest a certain amount. All in all, the data set captures the most important dimensions in investment agreements. I don't think there is anything major that's missing. Now, subsequently, the data set is being adapted into a web-based tool owned and disseminated by the ADB. It's not yet public, but very soon. And along with this report that's been published this morning, it can help users to find different ways to apply and to make use of this toolkit. So this data set will be for people to use the way they want. And there are many possible uses, as I'm going to explain in 2-3 minutes. That's something I really want to insist on. The toolkit is not a list of recommendations or a list of results that are given to policymakers. It's more than that, and it's better than that. It's an instrument that is made available and that policymakers can decide to use the way they want. Let's try to zoom in and focus now on the coding itself. That's a bit more of the methodology, but that's something I need to do. So let me focus on the coding itself here. As an example, we can look at the so-called fair and equitable treatment. As a very brief background of this type of provisions, let me say that fair and equitable treatment, that I'm going to abbreviate FET, is one of the absolute standards of treatment in foreign investment. It's contained in many investment agreements. In short, FET requires equality between foreign and domestic investors in particular circumstances, such as getting access to national agencies, courts, and imposing taxes and dealing with domestic regulations. Let me add that it's an important treaty provisions because it is, as a matter of fact, very often invoked by foreign investors in a number of disputes. And it's a very frequent breach of investment agreements that lead to the obligation to compensate. So if I may say, it's a costly obligations, and it's one that has tangible consequences. So in short, FET is a robust protection that leads to compensation that may sometimes offset all the benefits of investment agreements to attract FDI. So we also see on this slide examples of FET drafting. So how the FET is drafted in some IIAs. Okay, it's part of the report that's been released. It's also a guide for policymakers who are not so familiar with investment treaties, so that they can find many examples in terms of how FET is drafted, so that they don't miss a FET clause in a treaty they want to analyze. Now, in terms of coding, the dataset considers two options with respect to FET. Option one, if the FET clause is part of the treaty, is enshrined in the treaty, the provision is coded as number two, with an assumption of a positive effects on FDI. It's an assumption. It's not something certain. The assumption is based on the fact that by including a guarantee of due process, of consistency, so FET, the normative content of FET, the governments intend to increase the level of protection of the foreign investors. The government does so with the objective to, I would say, reassure foreign investors and so increase the volume of FDI. The second option is that there is no FET in the treaty. So if FET is absent, the provision is coded as 1. So here it's the reverse assumption. The government does not extend this right, the FET, to foreign investors because it thinks it's unnecessary, too risky, or redundant with domestic or international guarantees. It then means that this treaty without a FET cannot be expected as such to increase foreign investment. It may not be against, but that's not going to be something that directly or indirectly increase FDI. So to be clear, in terms of methodology, let me say that this coding has been done for FET across more than 1,000 BITs and FTAs. The same approach has been applied to the other 14 provisions across the same FTAs and BITs. So this approach or this methodology is certainly not the only one to analyze IIAs, but as Jong-Kyu alluded to, it is a consistent one, which we feel is crucial to compare large numbers of treaties and to analyze results based on a consistent dataset. Now, one step further, how to use the toolkit and what to expect from the toolkit. I'm going to discuss some of the applications. But I'd like to do one thing very simple. I'd like to tell you what the toolkit is not before I turn to what it is. So what it is not, the toolkit is not a ranking of investment agreements. It's not a ranking. We had a number of workshops to test the ideas, the codifications, and sometimes a few experts would look at that and say, oh, basically you are ranking the I. It's not at all a ranking. It has nothing to do with a ranking. It's not a rigid tool with only one or few possible uses. It's not a tool that replaces and supersedes some of the other tools, index, that exist elsewhere in the world. I mentioned just a few of them, you know, the heating map, the edit by the World Bank, the entire navigator. I think that has to be said very clearly because sometimes institutions or even individuals can be tempted to put forward their toolkit or index. And I think that it's largely irrelevant here. As far as we are and I am concerned, I would tend to use more than one toolkit or index, whether it's about trade or investment. So the ADB toolkit fills a gap because it offers a new and a different way to approach the analysis of, and I insist, a large volume of investment agreements. This is what the toolkit allows policymakers to do, and it's something that otherwise they could not do so easily. So now, what it is, in a few words, the coding of thousands of treaties and provisions in the IIA toolkit allow for pursuing many avenues for research in the expanding universe of IIAs. Let me highlight just a few. The toolkit allows for comparisons of provisions and also all treaties. The toolkit does not limit itself to a comparison of treaties. It can allow someone to compare a single provision, say the national treatment, as it was designed by one country, country X, over 10, 20, 30 years. It can also help to compare treaties, the treaties signed by country X with the treaties signed by country Y. Or you can compare the treaties signed by country X between 1980 and 1990 with the treaties signed between 2000 and 2005. All these applications are made possible by the way the toolkit was designed. So the toolkit allows to easily identify major trends in the drafting of IIA, not only the conclusion. It assists in identifying exceptions or unusual patterns that require more detailed study. The toolkit also allows to compare IIAs and or treaty provisions with other factors that affect FDI, such as taxation, ease of doing business, and many other elements. Okay, some other indexes can be combined at the time of the application of the toolkit. So overall, the key message for today is that the toolkit is a flexible tool. It's flexible because IIAs have evolved very fast over the last years and themselves have shown great flexibility, and this will continue. Over time, and depending on the case law, some provisions may take on more important roles than others. For instance, the FET provision that I earlier mentioned was largely ignored until the mid-2000s, possibly implying that no investor would take into account at the time of the investment. However, after many disputes, the FET has gained prominence in recent years. So IIA's drafting and applications will continue evolving. So it's important to have a toolkit that can adjust to most of these coming changes, which are unavoidable. Let me now give some examples of possible applications. For the sake of clarity, I will talk about a first group of applications, which we can call it the way you want, provision level indicators. The basic idea is using the toolkit to analyze provisions, the little details in the treaties. And then you have a second group of many applications, which we have called agreement level indicators. This is a more macro approach of treaties, and with this idea that large number of treaties and not just provisions can be compared. So in terms of provision level indicators, the basic idea, an example of application I want to share with you and that you can find in the report with even more explanations and examples. The basic idea is that the provision level indicators allow precise analysis of specific provisions, one of the 15 provisions we have seen a little earlier. For instance, a large number of definitions of the concept of investment can be extracted and compared across specific countries, region, and over time to identify trends and changing patterns. So the provision level also brings attention to the specific meaning and likely impact of each provision by grouping them in some possible indicators as the users will want. For instance, instead of simply comparing the definition of national treatment, so national treatment is one of the 15 provisions that we look at, one can prefer to look at the liberalization factors, indicators of many treaties and a series of treaties. So let me explain a bit further how this can be done quite easily. Most BITs, most investment agreements require that, subject to their domestic laws, parties shall encourage and admit into their territories investments by nationals and companies of the other party, classic. Now, the reference to domestic laws means that the commitment to encourage foreign investment is subject to existing or future restrictions on the entry of foreign investment contained in domestic legislation. So the priority accorded in these investment agreements to domestic laws reflect what I would call the fact that these treaties have been designed primarily to regulate the treatment of foreign investment after admission. And a fundamentally different approach to the admission of foreign investment is found in most IIAs concluded by Japan, Singapore, and a few other jurisdictions. These require the application of MFN and national treatment with respect to both admission and subsequent treatment of investment. And so in the ADB toolkit, one can develop some indicators by grouping provisions given their meaning. The users can decide to do so, can decide to focus on any treaty provisions that he or she thinks has an impact on liberalization. Once the grouping of these provisions is done, it is possible to calculate, for instance, a coefficient that indicates what a given treaty or a series of treaties achieve in terms of liberalization. Typically, the higher the indicator, the closer to 2, the more it is open to the local economy. The lower the indicator, closer to 1, the more that controls, the more it means that controls on foreign investment are in place. Careful, when the user will produce this kind of coefficients by using the toolkit, it's in no case an attempt to replace treaties or to impose a truth on some possible other details, measures, policies that may be in place. It is simply an indication that the treaty in question can only be expected in light of the provisions to liberalize FDI to a given extent. And the idea is to use this coefficient to make comparison to see whether this is correlated, for instance, by FDI flows or not. Okay, so it's in no case a ranking which promises a given treaty to produce fantastic effect. It's not at all what we do here. So this is just one example. The type and the number of applications of the provision level indicators is virtually unlimited. In fact, this report, which is 50 pages long, does not even provide the full list of possible applications. I come back to this idea. We have designed the toolkit thinking that it should be as flexible as possible and that the toolkit will find its use depending on the need of each government, agencies, NGOs, investors, well, anyone who wants to work with it in order to analyze a large number of treaties. Well, I think I had prepared another example at the agreement level, but for the sake of time, I'm going to skip it. I thought to discuss a bit another example of agreement level indicators, but that's something you find explained in great details in the report, which is now public. I think it's around pages 53 to 60, so almost 10 pages giving more and more examples. But again, I want to insist on the fact that the ADB toolkit does not impose the users a specific method to use the toolkit. It can really be used in many, many ways, and I'm sure that the ADB team would be very interested to know how researchers, policymakers are using the toolkit and what the kind of results they get thanks to these new instruments. Let me come to a very simple, very modest conclusion. 2 points here. I like to insist on first the idea that the ADB toolkit is a huge effort to code the ever-expanding number of IIAs in the Asia-Pacific region. As I said, the dataset covers more than 1,000 investment agreements with BITs and FTAs. That's important. FTAs have been too often neglected by many investment researchers. We cover them. Each agreement is coded with respect to 15 provisions. So in total, the ADB toolkit features close to specific 20,000 entries, which is, let's dare to say, huge. The report you have been circulated explains the data set. The same report is now available online for anyone, freely. The report simply explains the rationale, design, and possible uses of the dataset. The dataset, the ADB colleague I think will further explain that, will be released a little later in a few days, and this is when anyone will be able to have access to the data and use it to produce all kinds of results. The second point for my conclusion is that I wanted to briefly explain the rational design and purpose of this toolkit. I gave you 2 relatively simple but useful potential applications. The type and number of applications of the provision and agreement level indicators is virtually unlimited. Really, the toolkit could be used by, for instance, by a government willing to negotiate or renegotiate treaties. So these are 2 different needs and circumstances. But we can imagine a government having difficulties getting started for negotiations. We can think of a developing country. And the toolkit could be used by this country to compare what the other partner country has been doing over the years. So to identify more or less liberal treaties that protect more or less. And so the toolkit could use this developing country to question some of the requests made by the partner in the new negotiations. So I think it's important to mention that users should not think of the toolkit as something that's like a box. We press a button and we get a typical or perfect agreement. It does not make sense. It's not the objective. The objective is to facilitate the access to investment treaty information for a number of users like policymakers. Let me say that the toolkit could also be used by policymakers to assess the degree of protection and assess the probability to be sued. We can think of a new, I was about to say young, it's incorrect, but a new official working for government who decides to look at the existing stock of its country treaties and wants to get a sense as for whether there is a relatively high or low risk for being sued. Well, the index, the toolkit, can help to do that, and it can give some arguments to this official to explain to these colleagues that perhaps the stock of existing treaties lead the government to be relatively too much exposed to a number of lawsuits. So I'm going to close here. The toolkit, again, is very flexible, and I believe that it will find its use depending on the need of each government, investment agencies, NGO, investors. Again, the law firms might also find it useful for some other reasons. And so I think our hope, the team that has worked on that, the hope is that these events and the subsequent workshops will help disseminating this new tool, and as the tool will be useful to as many policymakers as possible in the region. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Chad, for your very insightful presentation on the toolkits and also the project that has lasted for the last 3 years. Well, today we are celebrating the 20th edition of the RCI Pod series. So I would like to thank again everyone who have joined the discussion for another excellent edition of RCI Pod. We have gathered a diverse group of experts who will discuss more in detail key issues on international investment law and how this toolkit can contribute to improving our knowledge of investment agreements in the Asia-Pacific region. We all know that the FDI has been really critical for the region's economic development and growth. While their importance is widely being recognized, the increasing number of IIEs are getting also much more complex, and the region can learn more about the mechanisms whereby these investment agreements can guide FDI policies. For example, which investment provision influence FDI entry mode, or do they influence the investment going into specific industries? And if so, how? How are different investment provisions interrelated, and how they impact investment? How can these investment treaties be also better designed to balance the interest, which might be conflicting at times between the states and then investors? And with our group of experts, we will discuss some of these questions. and hear from the first-hand experience on the efforts to improve the negotiation and effectiveness of the investment treaties. So I would first like to give the floor to each panelist to share some thoughts on the investment treaty toolkit, and also the database, how we can use the maximum out of it. Can we then give the floor to Professor Isds?
Thank you, Soo-Young, for the introduction, and thank you for all the presentations so far. They've been really interesting. I am an empirical researcher who's worked for the last 20 years on international investment agreements and looking at both the determinants of participation in those treaties and the impacts of those treaties on foreign direct investment, as well as the impacts of investor-state disputes. And I think I would like to applaud the exercise and the creation of the toolkit, because obviously as an empirical researcher, I value high quality objective data. I guess the warning I would like to put out is that it is very difficult to get it right when you're doing empirical studies, particularly on the determinants of foreign direct investment and the role of investment treaties. And in particular, when you're going down to individual aspects, like the 15 different aspects, you need to be very careful that what you're picking up is actually a causal effect and not just a correlation. And there's all sorts of issues of omitted variables, as well as many things happening often in economies at the same time that really need to be very carefully controlled for. And I know that even in the academic literature, there are a lot of studies who haven't got this right. So I think, you know, it's a note of caution, I would say, for those wandering in to try and use this data. Unless you have a PhD or at least graduate level econometrics behind you, I strongly recommend you partner with someone who does, or you might be in grave danger of getting the wrong answer. The other thing, if I may, one more quick thing is, I think it's fantastic that you've mentioned that the database will evolve, because of course these treaties are evolving all the time. There are new proposals all the time, and I think it's really important that people understand that, you know, as Julian said, we haven't got the right answer yet in the treaties, and so this will be an evolving space. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Professor Isds is actually from the Australian National University, so sorry that I forgot to mention that. Can I now invite the Dr. Intan from AREA just for a quick feedback on the toolkit and the database.
Thank you, Ms. Park, and also ADB for inviting me to participate in this webinar. Basically, I see that with the current situation, with the COVID recovery hope by the government, this is where having this toolkit would actually be a useful tool, policy tool for government to actually signal to the investors that somehow that there is actually a stable and predictable environment for investment. And also, it will also assist policymakers in terms of establishing open investment policies with structured and effective investment facilitation and developing justification, like what Prof. Chase was saying, that to actually perhaps give the justification for any renegotiation of IIAs currently that has been agreed by the Asia-Pacific region. Because what normally government officials have before them actually in coming up in designing IIA, they normally have like a separate variables in economic model. So it's very difficult to actually gauge in terms of the usefulness, in terms of the impact of the FDIs and how it actually served the specific interests of the country. So therefore, having this toolkit, which is a very laudable work, and also I see very extensive actually study in terms of looking at the interrelationships among the various provisions and agreement, assessing the II impact. It's not easy, of course, in real life, because at the end of the day, it boils down also to the external conditions, where at the end of the day, the quality of the governance and the regulatory position of the countries. Because, you know, ASEA has always been noted by the OECD FDI restrictiveness as being very restrictive, but somehow this can be a guide for the policymakers in terms of looking at how they can best reformulate the policy related to investment. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I now introduce Dr. Manzoor Ahmad, who's an international trade and customs expert. He is now serving as a chairman of the WTO trade dispute between the EU and then Indonesia. So Dr. Ahmad, can you give us like just maybe quick 1 minute, your impression and any feedback on the database and toolkit?
I'm just wondering, I could say something about the toolkit, but I also wanted to say, 2-3 minutes about some recent investment disputes that we had and how toolkit could be used for, such kind of, we didn't know what we got into. So would you like to do the two things together, or you just give my comments on this?
We'll have some of the country cases discussion in the panel. So if you have any, just a quick remark or suggestions for the toolkit, we would be appreciated.
Okay, the toolkit, it's a very impressive work, something like 1,200 investment treaties and 200 FTAs and more than 2,000 provisions. And, I at one time I was involved with some kind of similar task, and I know it's extremely arduous and time consuming and skillful exercise. And not only, I think that many countries after recent disputes, etc., I know Indonesia is doing it, India is doing it, Pakistan is doing it, South Africa. They're not only looking at the future, but they're also looking at all the treaties they had signed in the past. For example, Pakistan had signed over 50 treaties, and now they're looking at each one of them. And this tool will be extremely helpful for that comparison. That's I'd like to say. But if you'll give me later a couple of minutes, I'll speak about
yes.
our case.
We will. Okay, so we'll go back to Dr. Isbeth, and sorry, we'll just start with the okay. Can I address you, Emma? Emma, can you come? And I understand that you have worked extensively on the understanding the economic impact of investment treaties as an empirical researcher. In your research, you did use a law and an economics approach to explore how treaties can be better designed and also can help balance for the mutual benefits of host states and also investors. Can you share some of the findings of your earlier studies? And in your view, could this toolkit be used to improve your economic analysis?
Great. Yes, thank you, Ms. Pak. So I guess I have two things to say. One is that I was originally very skeptical. My original empirical analysis, way back in the early 2000s, showed very little evidence, in fact, no evidence of foreign investment being attracted by participation in bilateral investment treaties. And so hence my skepticism about some of the existing studies. More recent data has shown that there does tend to be an effect. So I have a recent paper, and particularly I think for the Asian countries and for the Eastern European countries around the time they opened up. African countries perhaps less so. But one thing that a recent paper of mine did find was that the benefits appear to disappear again as soon as you are hit with an investor-state dispute settlement. And so this is obviously problematic. And so considering the large costs of these disputes and, as we've said, designing and participating, there's concern that if you do attract investment through participating in them, that it evaporates as soon as you're hit by an investor-state dispute claim, even something that wasn't necessarily, bad governance, is problematic. So I have worked together for a few years now with Jonathan Bonniccia, who's a lawyer at the University of New South Wales, And we've really tried to combine our legal and our economic expertise and really understand what is the economic problem that we're actually trying to solve with these treaties. And my view as an economist, and it's shared by all the economists who talk about these treaties, is that the fundamental problem is what we might call time inconsistency of optimal policy, or what many might think of as the hold-up problem. So the concern that once an investor sinks costs, the government might have an incentive to change its policies once the investor is somewhat trapped, and then try and extract rents or even expropriate directly or indirectly. And so we propose a compensation rule that really focuses on exactly achieving this in investment treaties. And what's sort of novel about this is that unlike existing treaties, our rule does not punish governments for changes which have arisen purely as a result of new information. And obviously, in light of things like the COVID pandemic, we're all very aware that governments sometimes need to change rules in a way that hurts investors in light of new information and new states of the world. And so we're really, really excited about the fact that combining our law and economics approach, we've been able to come up with this. It's a relatively minor change, but it could have huge implications for the way treaties are designed and for the cost-benefit ratio for governments participating in them. So I might take the liberty of putting a few links in the chat after this for anyone who's interested in reading more about that proposal.
Thank you. Let me also introduce, one of our own ADB's legal expert, Christina Park, who's a principal counsel from the Office of General Counsel. Christina, well, you lead ADB's work on arbitration law, working with both governments and the private sector in the region. Perhaps to make things simpler for our audience, can you briefly explain the different arbitration mechanisms in Asia, from commercial to institutional arbitration, and where these international investment agreements can help?
Thanks, Sin-Young. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me. Really appreciate it. So I guess before going into what I'm going to talk about is really clarifying the various types of dispute resolution mechanisms for the different types of disputes. So today we're not talking about disputes between foreign commercial parties. That's private to private, and they normally prefer international arbitration because they see it as a form of effective, neutral, and fair form of dispute resolution mechanism. But this is between private and private, and it's governed by the National Arbitration Law of the seat, and it's enforced under a separate convention called the New York Convention. And this is an area that OGC has been working on. And today we're not discussing trade-related disputes between states. That's state-to-state disputes under the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. So the dispute that we are focusing on today is between foreign investor and a host state. So that's why it's called investor-state disputes. And as Professor Julian said, they arise under bilateral investment treaties, multilateral investment treaties, or free trade agreements with an investment chapter. So collectively, they're called international investment agreements. And I have to note that investor-state disputes are considered to be quite controversial for many reasons that all our speakers and I will touch upon later. So hopefully that'll be helpful in clarifying what we're talking about, what type of dispute we're talking about today. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for clarification. Let me go back to Intan again. So you were for many years Malaysia's lead negotiator on investment. What's your view about the emerging trends in the design and implementation of investment agreements? I mean, we want to look at the evolution as well, right? Like, what are the challenges faced by the government today in designing these treaties?
Thank you. I observed there are actually like 4 emerging trends in the design and implementation of the IIAs. One of it is something that is on everybody's thoughts always is the ISDS, because not only this is expensive, but we see diverse interpretations come out from every single tribunal that actually sits on the dispute. And government nowadays in trying to cater to that will somehow try as much as possible to ensure that the language it's it's somehow more detailed on substance and procedure, so that there is no room for diverse interpretation or potential dispute. That's one way of it. But of course, there are a lot of discussion and dialogues is being made on that. Even in UNCITRAL, I think one of it is actually, there's actually a ISDS reform working group that is being proposed to see how, at the end of the day, ISDS is going to apply. And the second trend is that the emerging of conservation of natural resources, environmental protection, and social well-being being included in investment policy making. So government are actually somehow looking at having this sustainable and responsible investment, so that they can actually be seen as somehow, like moving up the global value chain. The third trend is that government that before this, like for example in ASEAN, who have been recipients of FDI, are now looking at how they're actually protecting their investments overseas. So you see that's the third trend. And the fourth trend is that not only that, of course, the government always let the private sectors contribute in the influencing the economic growth, but I think I see more trend of the government actually having strategies with element of targeted investment promotion or restriction, so that whatever that is the objective of the private sector will be in line with whatever that the government wants to be in their national plans. So those are the four trends. And of course, like for example, like you were saying, the challenges that faced by the government in designing. At the end of the day, it's always about the balance, and the balance is that at one hand they want the FDI, and another hand they want to avoid the dispute. So there has to be a balancing of interest, and this is where we see that somehow RCEP being somehow the way forward now, having those concept of ISDS being put in the work agenda, which we do not know how it's going to turn out. And we see that somehow there are investment facilitation that has been included in the RCEP, which is very, very welcoming, given the work that has been done by JSI in the WTO. And of course, when it's JSI, it's still not been accepted by many, but when it's in the RCEP, so all the 15 countries would actually somehow be under those discipline, and especially when it comes into force. And lastly, the point that I would suggest that maybe ADB would like to see about how, at the end of the day, the implication of RCEP for all these 15 countries, having all those IIs before this. Like for example, for the ASEAN country, they have the AKIA, and they have the bilateral agreements that is already there. So it's always good if we could see how the implementation of RCEP at the end of the day, and how it will be charting the way forward for all the IIs in the future. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I mean, Dr. Ahmad. Well, our panelists have already noted the increasing number of investor-state disputes. Pakistan has been recently also involved in some very high-stake investment disputes with foreign investors. And how would you suggest that we can prevent these investment disputes? And can you also share what lessons that Pakistan experience can offer to other developing member countries?
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just a little bit of background. I think Pakistan was the first country that signed an investment treaty with Germany in 1959. And then on, we never had any problems. So we were signing up, and developing country, but over 50 agreements we signed. And recently we realized what we can get into, what we didn't really carefully think at that time. And give you two cases. One was with Australian incorporated company, TCC. And actually this company, the original investors are two multinationals. One is a Chilean and the other is a Canadian company, Barra Gold and Antofagasta. And they incorporated this company because it was what you call a treaty shopping. I mean, you know, because Australia has a bilateral investment treaty, so they used it as a cover for that. And they had conducted a feasibility study. They claimed they spent $200 million. And it was started in early 90s. But in 2011, they applied for this mining license, which was refused by the provincial government on the grounds that this was not done properly. There were some corrupt practices and there was too many concessions. Anyway, the company went to Exit for a dispute settlement, and Exit found Pakistan guilty and imposed a penalty which is almost $6 billion. Now this amount, this is double the highest ever, you know, the previous one thing. And the second.
Oh, Dr. Ahmad, you're muted again. You must have touched the mute button.
Sorry. Okay. So it was this beyond proportion, beyond. But what the award said is, you know, they said had the company been granted the mining license, had it worked on the lease for the next 50 years, and it would have earned these profits. So you know, the fact that the company didn't apply for a mining lease for almost 20 years, they were, you know, doing various other things, one company merging into another, etc. Nothing serious. And certainly we get with this. And some of the, not only in Pakistan, we are very upset, but if you look at global academics and experts like Jeffrey Sachs, he calls it this amount as due to flawed and corrupt investment arbitration process. And Professor Robert Housey of New York University, and you know, he's well-known name in Western state arbitration. He called this way of ascertaining a project's value as junk science. And then just one final quote from this Canadian professor, Tainahara, who found it appalling and a ridiculous sum of money. So this was one case. And now it's still going. They recently got attached our international airline. They own a hotel in New York and another in Paris. That was attached and under taken over. But just yesterday, we heard that for the time being, that has been released. Now the second investment dispute is even more bizarre. We negotiated with two these companies who track illegal accumulated wealth. And at the time in 2000, it was agreed that they'll be paid 20% of the value of any assets which they help us recover. But 2 or 3 years after, even immediately after the government signed, they realized that these companies had really cheated. They had no experience of investigation or recovery. So the government still waited for 2-3 years, but they found nothing, so they canceled the contract. Now these companies went to the London Court of International Arbitration in early 2016, and this case was decided in 2018. And they this arbitration ruled against Pakistan and asked it to pay $21 million plus interest, so something like $28 million. We just ended up paying that because they somehow, got our London High Commission account seized, etc. Now, this company had not really found even a single penny. I mean, and this case that on which they were awarded the sum, this was a local dispute, political dispute between the government and opposition, and the government said that this ex-prime minister had built up some property, but that property was never found to be illegal or anything. But okay, they valued that property for 100 million, and they said 20 million, 20% of that should go. And in fact, this company paid some penalties to that to our ex-prime minister for wrongly involving it. It's very strange, but that's what it was. So what I'm saying is for future, one, we should use this ADB toolkit to review all our previous treaties, and also we should develop a draft model like what India has done and some other countries, and so that we have a basic draft on the basis of which we could negotiate any future ones. Then I'd also suggest that the ADB, this toolkit, has got a lot of information and possible applications. So maybe ADB could organize some regular trainings. For example, I can imagine if ADB could hold an online training every 4 months to all government officials, so that they know how to use this toolkit. Sorry. And my final, point is from my background as WTO arbitrator, that we here in WTO arbitration, we have what we call advisory center on WTO law, which assists developing countries, gives them advice, and every year they issue something like 200 legal opinions, and that's very helpful. And that has considerably closed the legal gap between developed and developing countries. Now you see in the WTO disputes, I think more recently, it's the developing countries have been prevailing. It's not one-sided as it is with ICSID. So I think something like this, and why I'm suggesting that ADB, because global FDI, I think 1/3 of the total is now from Asian countries. And also, I think 1/3 of the total investment treaties involve Asian countries. So I think, and also ADB is, Asian countries are very active in developing this law, etc. So I'd suggest that they set up an advisory center to help developing countries, especially countries which are not, they have a very weak governance structure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Well, there were a lot of calls for the ADB support. I'm gonna go to Christina. Christina, well, you did actually mention, there are a lot of ADB's technical capacity support that for the DMCs. There seems to be some frustration among the DMC members about the international arbitration system, is for not being allegedly unfair, and then also catering to the interest of the larger multinational sort of companies. So what do you see this development in investor state dispute settlement, and then how can ADB support?
Certainly there's a lot of developments going on right now in the ISDS space. So, the major criticisms about ISDS is that, it favors foreign investors. It lacks transparency because, there's talk of like secret World Bank court, which is the ICSID court, under the ICSID convention. Just like in the Pakistan bid case, it results in disproportionate wars, that's basically not even, related to the amount of investment or how much the country can pay. So because of all these criticisms, there's been a lot of ongoing efforts by ICSID, by UNCITRAL. So there's a lot going on, but I guess the major one I can talk about is, well, there's transparency. So basically they're saying these types of investor state arbitration is very opaque. Nobody knows what's happening. So there's been a lot of movements on making these arbitrations more transparent. But I guess the big reform efforts are being led by the UNCITRAL Working Group 3. So they're looking into two different options right now: structural reforms or incremental reforms. And structural reforms is like a whole revamp of the investor state arbitration system. So they're actually looking at like sort of a court system, like multilateral investment court. So, and this is driven by what's happening in Europe. So there was this monumental case, the ACMEA decision, basically said the ISDS provisions in European BITs are like contradictory to EU law. So they've actually terminated like all their BITs, actually thousands of BITs, no, 130 intra-EU BITs. And they're also now looking beyond, the arbitration, but really looking at multilateral investment court. So that's the big reform, structural reform. But on the incremental side, it's basically relating to what the previous speakers are saying, like Dr. Mansour. So the incremental reforms relate to creation of the advisory center to really provide capacity building, similar to what the WTO has. So this is one of the proposals that's being considered by the UNCITRAL working group, which member states are a member of, right? And then also increasing member states' participation in interpreting treaties, because there's a lot of, as I guess Professor Inat said that different arbitral tribunals are coming up with different treaty interpretations, especially on the public interest obligation provisions. So there's that tension between the state's right to regulate, and then attracting FDI, but then there's the sustainable development goals. And because of that, there's been a lot of disputes because of that, especially in the renewable energy sector, and including under the Energy Charter Treaty. So again, the incremental is really relating to the capacity building that we were talking about, and DMC's need is that they really need to know what they're signing on to. They need to know, what their legal obligations are and what the implication is. Basically, implication could be huge. Like they could basically go to, investors could take them to arbitration, and then you end up with billions in awards, and it's a huge implication on your budget as well as your reputation and all that. But just one more thing, just in the Asia Pacific space, a lot of there's a new trend of different countries terminating existing BITs. So in Indonesia, India. Actually, India, they terminated BITs with 57 countries, and they're entering to like a whole different, different variation of BITs that are more narrowly tailored. And then just finally on the RCEP, and this is the interplay with, I guess, the WTO type of dispute settlement that RCEP is thinking of. So basically, RCEP, there's no, it doesn't contain an investor state dispute settlement mechanism. Instead, it basically says the parties will continue discussing, and within 2 years or sort of discuss what's going to happen. But just based on like articles that are out there, I think they are looking to establish something akin to the WTO mechanism, where it's really they're going to consider the WTO model and come up with more of a state-to-state type of resolution. And not award, not grant compensation to states, but really the states would benefit. So this is sort of like an ongoing thing that's happening as well. So there's a lot going on in dispute, as well as the public interest obligation, that whole tension. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Christina. Well, Christina already suggested quite a bit of like reform areas, and I'm gonna go to Professor Isds again. There have been a lot of discussion now about these reforms, and then we see environment, social standards, responsible business conduct, together with the requirement of the quality investment are catching on, and in the investment treaties, these are being incorporated much more. So how can we assess these kind of like 21st century goals in the investment treaties affecting the economies and then the FDI in the region?
Thanks. That's an excellent question. I think it comes down to there's two fundamental approaches to investment treaty reform. One is to make more law by trying to add things on the host or environment side to somewhat balance the currently very pro-investor law that's embodied in investment agreements. The other is to maybe make less law, in a sense, and restrict the number of things or the ways or the compensation available to investors when they feel their rights are being violated. There's different approaches, and I guess different pros and cons to those. One is, although if we want to make them more balanced by adding more protections for things like labour and environment and host right to regulate, the problem is that it makes it, as you will have seen in the creation of the database, this ever more complex body of law, particularly given the number of different treaties that most countries are involved in. And I think that ultimately is a problematic route for exactly that reason. So while toolkits can help us, ultimately we do very quickly start reaching the limits of you know, the amount of bureaucratic effort that states have at their disposal to negotiate all of these different treaties. And also we reach the limits of what we can actually meaningfully assess in terms of the impact of these individual changes in all these different treaties on FDI. So at some point, you know, if you throw all the variables of all these different treaty rules into your aggression, you'll have sort of more variables than you do data points, and really what you're getting out is garbage in the end. So I think, you know, data is a wonderful thing, but we also need to understand that there are limits to what it can meaningfully tell us.
Thank you. I hope that you know, the further evolution and then also a refinement of our database and then toolkit be able to also capture some of these new provisions going into the investment treaties. Well, I would like to you know, actually we're really running out of time, but I would like to open the floor for any burning questions from the floor, if anyone wants to have the final questions. Everybody's shy, or it actually is a bit too complex to discuss. So again, I would like to congratulate the team that have made excellent effort to really compile the large data set over really long time. I know how much time and efforts that have been gone to this database and then also the toolkit, and then I really appreciate everybody taking time to understand the probably also the structure and the use of the toolkit. And thank you, Professor Shas, for really excellent presentation that gives us, you know, like basic structure of this toolkit, and then how it can be applied to improve our understanding of investment treaties. Please do not hesitate to consult our Asian Regional Integration Center, ERIC, where the database is already available. We will continue update this information in the database, and then you know, continue also upgrade in the future. And I would like to finally thank our audience today. We hope that you know, everybody learned something as much as I have learned, and then I look forward to our next RCI Pod webinar very soon. Thank you very much, and then have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. Excellent work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
much.
much. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Stay safe.
Stay safe.
Stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mazur.